to the clock, and I know our time's getting away from it. It always does, because I have so many things I want to ask you about. But I probably should ask you just some straightforward editing questions, and then we should maybe think about calling it a day before I wear you out completely. I appreciate you being so very generous with your time today. One question the esteemed audience knows I have to ask you, and while we're kind of in the weeds anyway, Lauren Smulski, have you ever seen a flying saucer, and do you believe in them?
I've never seen one, but I am absolutely 100% willing to entertain the idea that there are alien lives out there.
Fair enough. An esteemed audience knows all too well where I stand on the subject. It's a thing, for sure. Do some research. You'll be on my page by the end of the day. All right, well, let's talk a couple of... I'm gonna try and pick your brain for some free info, if that's all right. Just some questions I want to ask you about, specifically about editing. So I know that one of the things that you're doing is you're looking for biggest mistakes specifically in world building. So what are some of the biggest mistakes you're seeing authors do in world building? I'm going to ask you that same question about some other aspects as well. Well, let's start with world building.
Okay, so there's two very common mistakes that can be done in world building. One is either info dumping, which is, like you're just throwing a bunch of information about the world on the page for the reader to just kind of absorb and digest, but not really infusing it organically. You can't just dump it on the page like it's a history book or something like that. You need to actually infuse it into the world, introduce it in a way that feels as if it's within the character's knowledge base, I guess. So if they, have some innate knowledge about how their town works or how a certain type of magic works or whatever, you want to try to explain it to the reader, A, in the proper moment when it makes sense to do so, but also B, within a context that makes sense for that character's knowledge base. So info dumping is a very common error that we see in manuscripts. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, not enough exposition and not enough world building, where you're seeing, you're talking about this very esoteric magic system and you're like, oh, there were these swirling colors and patterns and blah, 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 blah. But okay, I don't care. What is it? How does it work? What spell are you using? What is your thought process happening here? How are you actually manifesting this magic? What's your training been like? All of those things run through my mind. I am the editor who's going to sit there and just poke holes in everything. Say I need to know how that works. We may not actually put it on the page, but I need to know for my own knowledge how this works. So, like I said,
and I know it varies from project to project. There's no good way to answer this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What is the appropriate ratio of exposition to forward action, especially in the beginning of a story? And what are the best ways to work that exposition in where you're not grinding the story to a halt in an info dump?
Again, it varies, again, like you said, from story to story. But I think, the balance is you want to make sure that you're giving the reader enough info that they feel like they're thoroughly grounded in the world, that they understand, fairly early on how certain things work, but not giving them more information than they need for that given moment. If you're going to build up to a point where okay, the main characters are going to go on this crazy quest, and at the end of the book, they're going to get to this place that I'm going to have to explain in great detail. The reader doesn't need to know about that place or all of the details about, the lore of that area or all the details of the different places they're going to go on this quest from the outset. You need to supply the reader with enough information to understand the world and what the characters are doing within that world at that moment. And of course, and continue to build on that as the story unfolds. Like I said, infusing the information in organically as it makes sense to do so. It's always a very interesting balance to try to strike. But at the same time, something also to keep in mind is making sure that you're not bogging down the pacing with too much exposition. Because I'm sitting there and you're, rattling off this, multi-paragraph description of this beautiful room and the gorgeous dress that she was wearing and the, flickering lights and the atmosphere and so on and so forth. That's delightful. I love reading about it, but what are the characters doing? Why does this matter? So you want to balance it out with definitely making sure that you're setting the scene, but keeping the story actually moving forward and making sure the characters are actually doing things and not just admiring the scenery. So, one of the biggest issues I have with, for example, Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien will take 3 or 4 chapters to write a battle scene that could have taken place in 1 chapter. So.
Oh, angry emails coming your way now.
I'm sorry, Tolkien fans. The Battle of Helm's Deep, man, does not need as many pages as it got.
No, I'm on record from previous shows stating that emphatically I think The Lord of the Rings is boring. The first one, anyway. Two Towers gets a little bit more exciting. And then the third one's fine. But that first one, especially with the House of Tom Bombadil and the constant singing and the description of everything I would never need to know.
Context.
So, yeah. But when you're the only game in town and you're the first heralding, well, I don't think he was the first, but one of the first heralding a new renaissance of fantasy, I guess you can get away with some things that you just can't get away with these days.
Yeah.
But Charles Dickens did it is never an argument for why you're doing something in 2019. Yeah. So, okay, that's world building. Next position, how about character development and motivations? What are mistakes that you're seeing, and what are some good reliable methods to relay those motivations without flat out just telling the writer this or telling the reader this character wants this? Or should you do that?
I think that there are, there's ways to subtly build up what the character motivations are by the way that they react to things and the way that they interact with people within the world. And the goals that they have as characters, like if they're saying, if they're reacting to someone they meet with, disgust, or they're just kind of dismissing everything that they're saying, then it becomes very, very clear that they don't value that person or that person's opinion or whatever they're contributing, to their maybe they're not contributing to their overall goals and motivations. Whereas if they have a mentor that they're like worshiping at their feet and, taking everything they say as biblical context or something like that, then that gives some clues and in terms of what their priorities are and, what they're trying to accomplish. And again, as if they're saying I want to go here and do this and all of that. Yeah. I mean, there are ways to subtly infuse those things into the manuscript without spelling out this is my goal and I'm going to achieve it. That can work in certain contexts, especially if that's the kind of voice that you're writing in. I definitely worked on a book recently that, did a lot of that fourth wall breaking. If you're talking to your audience and you want to tell them what your motivation are, then sure, that totally works. But most of the time it's something that's, very subtly infused, and unveiled over the course of the story, and not necessarily set up right from the get-go.